It's great to be here to introduce Alan Liu. For a quarter century now, Professor Liu has been one of the crucial mediators, streaming fresh and free thought from other disciplines upon the stock notions and habits of English literary study, and suggesting further how our theories and practices might inform those of our disciplinary neighbors. Professor Liu is chair of the Department of English at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he is also affiliated with UCSB's Transdisciplinary Graduate Program in Media Arts and Technology. He took his BA magna cum laude from Yale in 1975 and received his PhD and along the way a degree in creative writing from Stanford before returning to teach at Yale for a few years in the 1980s. In 1988, he joined the English department at Santa Barbara, where he's taught ever since. In the first place, Professor Liu has contributed to the cross-disciplinary energization of English studies as a practitioner, theorist, and critic of the New Historicism. Since the New Historicism has reigned as the normative methodology in English for decades now, it can be hard to recall what a struggle it was to make the interdisciplinary mediations between history, anthropology, and literary studies that so revitalized all three disciplines in the 1980s. Professor Liu is one of the pioneers of New Historicism in British Romantic studies, beginning with his 1984 ELH article, Wordsworth, The History and Imagination. As that essay's title intimates, from the first, his interest in history had a metacritical and metahistorical dimension. And where Hegel had once imagined philosophy encountering the spirit of history in the person of Napoleon, Liu, in his monumental first book, Wordsworth, The Sense of History, posited an implacable foe of Napoleon's, William Wordsworth, as an iconic figure for literature's denial of the traumas of historical experience, and also eventually for its historicist knowledge work of textual recollection. As his long, 726-page first book began to make its considerable impact, Professor Liu was proving a master of the short form of the essay. Beginning in 1989, he published articles in ELH, Representations, and other leading journals articulating his complex sense of the promise of and the problems with what he has come to call postmodern historicism. These articles remain so fresh that they form the core of his third and most recent book, an essay collection published in 2008 by the University of Chicago Press, which takes its title from one of them, Local Transcendence. Yet whereas the original article by that title bears a subtitle announcing a concern with the romanticism of detail, the book is subtitled Essays on Postmodern Historicism and the Database. The book connects, that is to say, with the second main transdisciplinary stream that Liu has undertaken to mediate for us, the infusion into the humanities of digital information. In 1994, Professor Liu started a website, The Voice of the Shuttle, which soon became the main portal on the internet where one could find, conveniently gathered together, links to resources for at first literary study and soon for humanities research and pedagogy generally. As a pioneer in the digital humanities himself, he was well positioned to write what the subtitle of his second book, 2004's The Laws of Cool, announces as its topics of knowledge work and the culture of information. This landmark study of the ecology of knowledge and the character of labor in networked postmodernity has contributed greatly to the conversation about the digital and the humanities that we hope to carry further in our symposium this weekend. And finally, when it comes to our more particular symposium topic of teaching and learning, Professor Liu brings much practical experience to supplement his conceptual reflections. At Santa Barbara, he founded a National Endowment for the Humanities Teaching with Technology project called Transcriptions, Literature and the Culture of Information, while helping in his home department to create an undergraduate specialization on literature and the culture of information. As a member of the board of directors of the Electronic Literature Organization, in recent years, he chaired the Technology Software Committee of that organization's initiative for the preservation, archiving, and dissemination of electronic literature. Finally, he is currently involved in a multi-campus collaborative research group at the University of California devoted to research the technological, social, and cultural practices of online reading. And this group is developing ROSE, a research-oriented social environment, which I look forward to exploring one day soon. These projects are informing his current series of philosophical and practical essays on media histories and the humanities, and informing, I expect, his talk for us today, to which we all look forward very much. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll begin this way. The ideal keynoter at a symposium of the present sort titled Digital Humanities Teaching and Learning would be both a digital humanist and an expert in educational technology studies, administration, and policy. For example, a type of scholar who could confidently give papers at both the annual Digital Humanities DH conference staged by the Alliance of Digital Humanities Organizations, which, quote, promotes and supports digital research and teaching across all arts and humanities disciplines, close quote, and the annual conference of EDUCAUSE, quote, whose mission is to advance higher education by promoting the intelligent use of information technology. That ideal keynoter would have broad and specialized knowledge of past and present trends in distant, interactive, and hybrid mediated teaching and learning in higher education as a whole, and in the humanities specifically. Even better, that ideal keynote would also be able to address educational technology across learning levels from K-12 to adult, across nations, for instance, through the Commonwealth, Europe, and the East, and across social professional sectors, nonprofit, for-profit, and business. Dear colleagues, that ideal keynoter on teaching and learning with, in, and about the digital humanities is not me. Digital teaching and learning are not my primary research areas as such. Therefore, I have no keynotes for you on that topic. But I do have key questions. They're big questions, or to qualify, they're the biggest I can currently see from my dual boundary perspective. I come before you today, on the one hand, just as a working digital humanities scholar, whose involvement with the educational use of digital technologies has been on the practical level, beginning around 1998, when a NEH Teaching with Technology grant allowed me to start a research and curriculum development initiative at my campus in Santa Barbara called Transcriptions, Literature and the Culture of Information, which is now directed by my colleague Rita Rayleigh. Recently, I've been teaching in that initiative a series of experimental digital project building courses called Literature Plus. They've been a great deal of fun. I published an article a few years ago about those courses in an online journal that is published from where you are at UT Austin titled Currents in Electronic Literacy. On the other hand, however, I also come before you today as a department chair who has been forced to take a larger view of the issues after serving during 3 of the worst budgetary years in the history of the University of California system. Last year, in addition, I served on one of the working groups, the Research Strategies Working Group of the so-called UC Commission on the Future, which are systems regents formed to draw up recommendations for UC's long-term future in an era of massive public disinvestment in higher education. The shift in scale between those two perspectives, the one focused on digital changes in the ordinary work of research and teaching, the other looking out on the way digital changes reflect or facilitate the tectonic shifts now occurring on campus, state, national, and global horizons, is generative of what I mean by big in the title of my lecture. The questions I want to ask today are big because they link individual, small group, departmental, or project scale digital research and teaching, where if you're like me, digital humanists spend most of their time, and systemic, world scale digital education changes. In this talk then, I aim just to ask, not to answer, some of the big questions. Those of you who were at the panel on the history and future of the digital humanities that Kathleen Fitzpatrick organized at this year's MLA will recognize that actually to answer some of these questions would first require answering the prior question that was the title of my talk at that panel: where is cultural criticism in the digital humanities? I'll begin by zooming out to the proper scale of analysis. And I'll start with the digital humanist typical ground level view of teaching in the digital age. Matt, if you could go on to the next slide. This is a tangle of wires in the corner of the classroom, which is our main teaching facility in our English department. It's the kind of hardware mess that a digital humanist first encounters when walking into the classroom. Exactly how long, for example, is that cable? Will it reach the table or not? I estimate that about 20% of the thinking power that goes into a classroom now is devoted to messing around with technology at the very beginning of it. Matt, if you could go on to the next slide. The equivalent kind of tangle on the software side of instructional technology looks something like this. This is a screenshot of the source code from an early iteration of the very good roll your own wiki called PBWiki, which is now called PBWorks. In those days, this was about 2 or 3 years ago, the source code looked like spaghetti code, because as you see in all the container attributes in the middle of the screen, the editing functions in the GUI interface were inserted into the source code along the way. And an instructor like myself who wanted some command of the source code spent literally hours each week detangling the source code in order to get the website to look properly formatted. PBWorks has now solved that problem. It's one of the finest, roll your own kinds of instructional platforms and technologies that are available, in my opinion, today. However, as fascinating as those two tangles are, the tangle of wires that I've most recently been studying with intense study and fascination, next slide, is this one. This is a shot of the Ethernet cables, the optical security cables for hardware, and the power source in the dead center of the floor of our former English department office at UC Santa Barbara. Now I'm going to begin enlarging the intellectual perspective or scale here from my perspective as a chair, as I mentioned earlier, forced to look out on the larger intellectual and practical landscape of the issues. Now, I said just a moment ago, showing you this slide that's now on the screen, former English department office. Indeed, this tangle of Ethernet security and power connectors I'm showing you is the key to the redesign puzzle I am currently trying to figure out for our past department office, as we are busy reconfiguring it into what we are calling our collaborative research commons space for the department. Next slide. You can see there some of the floor plans and a shot of the empty room that's now being renovated. We're going to redesign this into an open plan curricular and research development space where our graduate students and faculty can work together on digital humanities projects and initiatives, circled on the periphery by some of the offices for our internal department centers, which currently don't have physical spaces. Now, of course, it might seem to you that the opportunity to design from the ground up a digitally optimized space for collaborative research and curricular development is a digital humanist utopian fantasy, even if my department will not have the funding for design concepts and furnishings to match, for example, Patrick Svensson's Hum Lab at Umeå University in Sweden, highlighting Hum Lab over other digital humanities spaces that might be mentioned, because as some of you may know, Patrick Svensson has a well-developed interest in touring and writing about design spaces for the digital humanities. However, this is not utopia I am showing you. It is post-recession California. You might ask, what happened to the 7 dedicated English department staff who once made this space the department's cultural commons, our village, as we were used to call it? Where did they go? Here, I'm going to begin zooming out further. It's a little bit like launching yourself up in Google Earth in dizzying speed from Street View to Map View, finally to whole globe view. Next slide. This is an org chart that you're seeing for the reorganization of staffing in the humanities departments on our campus. It was decided that to save funding, that the staff would be extracted from individual departments and centralized in collective bureaus within each building. So we've now lost our department staff. It's been one of the most wrenching cultural changes that I've been witness to in my time on any campus. Next slide. That move itself was forced after a series of cuts in instructional budget. In fact, the staffing cuts were finally decided upon as a way to prevent further instructional cuts. You're seeing on the right there a page from my chair's notes for one of our budget cut meetings in my department 2 years ago. Among the cuts that we made that affected instruction are some of these. Our Introduction to Literary Studies class, English 10, which used to be taught in multiple numbers of small courses, is now taught in large lecture courses of 200 students each. I don't know whether my former student and good friend Jeremy Douglas is now in the audience. He taught some of the best of those. Hi, Jeremy. He taught some of the best of those English 10 courses in a small format in my experience, and that opportunity for both the undergraduates and for our graduate students in training is now gone. Other experiments are Introduction to Shakespeare course, English 15, is now taught in the format of 200 student lectures with no sections. We've also started a set of courses taught by a very magnetic professor, Professor Enda Duffy, in a format of 400 students with no sections, which led to some amazingly humorous and tangled logistical issues. We didn't think until the first day that papers needed to be handed back, that there was a puzzle involved in actually how you hand back 400 papers to students whose faces you don't recognize. Other experiments, we've expanded some of our bread and butter 38 student courses to 70 students with a reader. The bottom line is that so far, for the last 3 years, our department has held steady with course seats made available to students, even though, and this is not an original thought, it's a thought that I've seen often online, even though experiments like this are already de facto distant education before you touch a single wire or cable of digital technologies involved. This really is the horizon of distant education in which we are thinking today. And indeed, I would suppose to you that the real frame from which we henceforth have to think about the digital humanities in a pedagogical perspective is a frame of budget cutting like this. These are the kinds of experiments, if you go on to the next slide, Matt, that our non-early adopter faculty are now thinking about as they adopt in a rush digital technologies of one sort or another. They're adopting Scantron for English classes, which we've never used before. They're adopting Clicker, some with some excitement. They're adopting Moodle, our branded version of Moodle, Gaucho Space. These are not the early adopter digital technologists. These are the people who are forced kicking and screaming into using the new technologies because they see this as a way to mitigate some of the damage of the real, what I've been calling distant education that we have been introducing. I would put it to you that the kinds of digital technologies that most of us probably in this room are most interested in, for example, Web 2.0 technologies, blogs, content management systems, Second Life, and so on, wikis, these are in the realm now of luxuries, serving only what my dean likes to call boutique courses. We really have to think about the larger frame of this. Next slide, please, Matt. So now I will zoom out all the way to the largest frame, or rather set of frames that I can think of, and I'm compressing these together into a single large black hole. The UC system, state, national, and global, really, budget cuts that are now on the horizon. You know all this already. It is, however, useful, I think, for me to list some of the highlights, or rather lowlights, of the budget cuts in the UC system to start with. During the past 20 years, state support for per student educational costs has dropped by 50%, 57%, adjusting for inflation. In a single year last year, the UC system raised student tuition 32%, reaching the threshold, which we will cross by next year, across which funding by the state for students will now, for the first time, be lower than the individual students' funding for their education. And we are facing next year a minimum of a $500 million additional cut for the UC system, which represents 16.4% of state support. That's roughly equivalent to total state support for the UCLA campus, or the combined state support for 3 of the smaller campuses. And that's not to include unfunded mandates that the state legislature likes not to mention, including mandatory costs for health benefits, retirements, utilities, and so on. If you add those in, we're facing a minimum of a $1 billion cut in state support for the UC system next year. And if I were to cross-reference here, I would at this point immediately look up at you in the audience and say, Texas. I've been reading about the scale of the state deficit in Texas, and reading about some of your fears about the UT system in the future. One of the reasons I most wanted to be with you today in the flesh was to be able to talk to you and find out from the ground level what's happening in the UT system now and in the foreseeable future. And if I can just mention one other global analog, of course, we need only mention the Brown Report and what is happening in the United Kingdom right now, where the entire set of budgetary cuts is simply referred to by the one noun, not cuts. I'm only department chair, of course, So I don't have all the telescopes that could be trained on the big picture that are available to university deans and presidents, government secretaries or ministers, and so on. But I've been able to bring some telescopes of my own to bear on the larger scene. Next slide. I've written a book, as Sam Baker mentioned, called The Laws of Cool, which deliberately set out to place issues having to do with digital media, technology, and the humanities in the context of larger economic and sociological issues. And I have the good fortune to be a colleague in my department with Christopher Newfield, who's become a specialist in not just the specific plight of the University of California system and the public education in this nation, but of its relationship to larger national and global issues. You see there on the screen one of his most recent books, The Endmaking of the Public University, the 40-year assault on the middle class, which came out in 2008. And you see on the right his very well visited blog called Remaking the University, which was one of the Bibles really of an informal sort during the UC budget crisis in the last 3 years. Next slide. I mentioned earlier as well that I served on the UC Commission on the Future. In the Research Strategies Working Group, I led a subgroup of that on research principles and mission. And my main tasks were two. I set out to imagine how the humanities might contribute to the UC system competing for a presidential scale grand challenge contest of one sort or another, but the humanities and the social sciences might have to contribute to the sciences, who are normally most thought of in such grand challenge competitions. And one of the most eye-opening exercises that I conducted was a systematic survey of social science and humanities departments in the UC system, asking them, pleading with them for showcase examples of social science and humanities research that might have public awareness, recognition, and public impact of a sort to match the kinds of lists that the scientists already have available on their websites of, for example, cures for diseases and great technological engineering innovations that they've contributed to society. That has really begun to open my eyes to the constraints, but also the opportunities of the future of the humanities, and notably of the digital humanities, since many of the showcase examples I gathered were in the digital humanities field. So with all that behind me, here are the big questions I want to ask. Next slide. I'm going to organize them for you as a tree diagram. So here are the big questions I want to ask, only some branches of which, for the sake of time, I'm going to be able to drill down into beyond the secondary level into the tertiary level. The root question, next slide, is simply this. What do we want the University of the Digital Future to be? Now, this is a deceptively obvious question, but I will put it to you that few of us, least of all those involved at the ground level of digital teaching and learning, actually ask ourselves this question, even as we're busy exploring or creating new course software tools, network resources, pedagogical practices, digital humanities programs, and so on. More troubling, I believe that not even stakeholders at higher levels, for example, the leaders of universities, funding agencies, government, and business, and so on, are properly asking this question simply, though profoundly, because no one yet understands who the we is that is the subject of the sentence, what we want the University of the Digital Future to be. For example, do we mean we in research universities, liberal arts colleges, or community colleges? We in public, private, or for-profit education? We in the academy or larger society? And if in larger society, we the public, the private, or the non-governmental sector? Equally, there's no consensus yet on who the implied them is in the sentence, would be served by digitized universities as the object of education, an object called what? Citizen, public, client, consumer, nation, world? To set up for drilling down into this root question, let me place in evidence now a few recent position statements on the digital future of higher education. Next slide. This is Bill Gates on the topic. He's been actually very vocal in the last year on this topic. At a Technonomy conference last year, he said in a statement that went viral on the web, 5 years from now on the web, for free, you'll be able to find the best lectures in the world. We bet better than any single university. College, except for the parties, needs to be less place-based. In the same year, in his annual letter for the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation, he said, "We need to bring together the video and interactive pieces for K-12 and college courses. We should focus on having at least one great course online for each subject rather than lots of mediocre courses." Next slide. This is Steve Forbes' vision, titled in a piece in Forbes magazine called Dinosaur U. "The internet," he says, "is about to do to America's universities and colleges what is done to media and entertainment, profoundly upend them and improve them." Quoting, Louis Latave, Dean of Boston University School of Management and former president of Ford of Europe, points out, quote, "Digital technology offers fascinating approaches to improve cognition. If you can buy a self-paced calculus course on DVD for $67, is it worth spending $5,000 to take the same course at a private university? Of course, the mutual learning that occurs in college is of value, but is it worth spending 75 times more for the same body of knowledge?" And just by way of comparison, I read recently about Tim Pawlenty, the governor of Minnesota, who in an interview with Jon Stewart in June of 2010 said in roughly the same way, "Instead of paying thousands of dollars, why not spend $199 for what he calls iCollege," close quote. Next slide. This is Peter Thiel's vision. I'm quoting here from an article in Business Week of this year. Quote, "Libertarian venture capitalist and macro hedge fund investor Peter Thiel has started a program that will award fellowships of $100,000 to 20 entrepreneurs under the age of 20 on the condition that they drop out of college for 2 years to pursue their ventures full time," close quote. That program has now begun, and right off the bat, it's recruited students to drop out of college to become miniature versions of Bill Gates. In this vision, you drop out of college in order to start your Microsofts and so on. Next slide. Now we enter the realm of the visionaries of higher education proper. This is a op-ed piece that appeared in the LA Times from Christopher Edling, the dean of the UC Berkeley Law School, which became quite controversial in our system. Writes Edling, "It is time for an 11th University of California campus, a cyber campus devoted to awarding online degrees to UC eligible students. No budgetary alchemy will allow us to educate the state's future universities in the same way we do now, but with less money. The budget cuts caused by the state economic crisis are real and huge, leaving two choices. Educators can do less with less, or we can explore new ways of providing value to California and the nation by doing more, albeit differently, with less." And then skipping to further in his comments, "There are examples of failure in online education, but none involve degree-granting instruction by a premier institution with the kind of market appeal that UC campuses enjoy, not just in Barstow, California, but in Bangor and Beijing," close quote. And by way of comparison, there's plenty of iceberg under this particular tip, and in fact, many other campuses that are well advanced beyond the current pilot project in the UC system, which is designed to test Edley's hypothesis of an 11th virtual campus. University of Maryland system, for example, now requires undergraduates to take 12 credits in alternative learning modes, including online modes. The Minnesota State Colleges and University system, I read, is pushing to have 25% of credits earned online by the year 2015. And I've just read recently that your state, Texas, the report of the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board in 2009, under the governor's mandate, is to recommend undertaking a broad and comprehensive review of system-wide opportunities for achieving cost efficiencies, and in particular recommending that students be required to complete at least 10% of their degrees outside the classroom through options like online courses, close quote. And that's quoting a higher education chronicle story on the topic. And finally, next slide. This is a report that just came out from the UK Higher Education Funding Council for England. It's really quite worth reading, I think, because it is symptomatic of international trends in this direction. The report is titled "Collaborate to Compete, Seizing the Opportunity of Online Learning for UK Higher Education." And I'm just going to read one short paragraph from it. It's a 90 or so page report. "In light of the independent," I'm quoting, "in light of the independent review of higher education funding and student finance report," that's the so-called Brown report, On severe constraints on public funding and a shift towards a more deregulated market approach to higher education, our task force has concluded that online learning provides real opportunity for UK institutions to develop responsive, engaging, and interactive provision, that's their term for provision of education, which, if offered at scale, can deliver quality and cost effectiveness and meet student demands for flexible learning, close quote. With all that in evidence, now let me drill down into the question of what we want the digital university of the future actually to be. A secondary tier of questions might begin with this inquiry. Next slide. Does digital technology promote education as a public or a private good? Now, I'm not going to have the time to do this with each of my secondary questions, but just to indicate to you how rich and deep the inquiry goes, I'll take the occasion here to unpack the issues by means of a tertiary tier of questions. Next slide. The first of these tertiary questions is, what is the ecology of academic, governmental, philanthropic, for-profit, corporate, and other stakeholders in providing digital education? The context is a broader mix of educational provision, as the British say, in the post-industrial knowledge economy, whose economy, placing that word in quotes, includes new forms of collaboration/competition between formerly distinct niches of knowledge providers that might be best understood less on a classical economic model than on an ecological model. We know, for example, that Microsoft and Google today don't have company headquarters, they have self-styled campuses, heralding that like other post-industrial firms, they see themselves as primarily in the business of knowledge. Now, when both universities and businesses deal in knowledge, what is the right ecology of, and this is a business term, co-opetition among all the stakeholders? Should society be optimized into a monospecies ecology, a kind of cash crop of corporatized educational combines, equating all knowledge provision with good business and vice versa? Or does society need a more complex ecology of differentiated knowledge institutions, among which place-based colleges and universities will still have a valuable place? Next slide. A related tertiary question: will the students of digital education be economic individuals or citizens? For example, when a public university system like mine increases tuition 32% in a single year and is about to cross a threshold where it invests less in the education of students than the students themselves, are we de facto saying that higher education will henceforth be a private good, no matter whether you're in a private university or in a so-called public university? In other words, you put down your bet on your own future, you rake in whatever you win in the house, in this case, a knowledge economy that benefits from having a broad, exchangeable, and so individually disposable pool of knowledge workers cleans up. Next slide. Yet another tertiary question. What will be the labor model of the university of the digital future? Recall Bill Gates' prophecy that students just need, quote, the best lectures in the world, and, quote, at least one great course online for each subject rather than lots of mediocre courses, close quote. If you follow that logic to its conclusion, then we're in the higher education version of one of my least favorite movies, The Highlander. There will be one. We won't need universities in the plural, just the digital equivalent of a single faculty distilled in each field to a single best educator or course. Similarly, next slide, what will be the intellectual property model of the digital university of the future? In her very good book, Who Owns Academic Work? Battling for Control of Intellectual Property, which appeared in 2001, Corinne McSherry traces the complex history of accommodations and set-asides that carved out from American industrial capitalism the special status of academic work, according to whose conventions, for instance, professors, as opposed to their employer universities, own the copyright for their writings, on the premise that the university system as a whole returns a common good to the public. But it's not clear today, McSherry shows through interviews with university scientists now busily patenting their discoveries, that the traditional balance between private and public intellectual property that constitute higher education as an economic agent can continue in the face of today's knowledge work capitalism, with its relentless drive toward the corporatization of both the private and the public forms of intellectual property. The private form through the trend by which university professors start up companies or the universities create licensing arrangements for them based on their academic research, and the public form through the digital millennium copyright law and similar juridical and/or unlegislated technological developments, as Lars Lensing has argued, by which corporations de facto fence in ever larger expanses of previously common or fair use intellectual property. One interesting phenomenon to track in this regard, for instance, is how open access digital teaching movements, as studied by Taylor Walsh in her 2011 book, Unlocking the Gates, How and Why Universities Are Opening Up Access to Their Courses, seem to be evolving to mirror or directly contribute to the new form of, let's call them aggregator open access monopolies, epitomized by Google and others. The unbalanced property structure of an aggregator open access monopoly may be expressed roughly as follows in regard to educational resources. You put your course materials online for free, and all the content-hungry aggregators ranging from branded university online initiatives to Apple's iTunes U or Google's YouTube U end up owning, in the sense of being able to capitalize on, the whole of what you have contributed. Compare, for example, the UK Higher Education Funding Council for England's report on Collaborate to Compete that I earlier cited. Further along, it proposes, quote, one business model is to use openly available resources as a free taster for content through platforms such as iTunes U, with the prospect of good conversion rates as individuals subsequently sign up for accredited degree courses, close quote. Excuse me. More questions along this branch of inquiry about the relation between private and public good in digitized education are possible. But now let me break off and take up another secondary branch of my root question about what we want the university of the future to be. Next slide. Here's another secondary question under my root question. What will be the relation between local and global education? I'm not going to make my tree diagram over busy or take the time to detail the tertiary questions on this and further branches of my inquiry in a manner proportional to my previous discussion. But I am going quickly to sketch the possible sub-questions that flow from the local-global question as follows. We recall Bill Gates saying, college, except for the parties, needs to be less place-based. Think first about the localism of educational place and what that actually means. The embedding of education in concentric or overlapping family, neighborhood, parish, town, state, national, another state, or in other orbits of personal and working identity. If we displace the university, what happens to the, let's call them currents of unfixed personal, social, political, economic, and cultural energies, never more unfixed than in the post-adolescent walkabout years between the constraints of family and workplace, as those currents seek channels of commitment binding the individual to the collective. Let's not fool ourselves. All the swarms, hives, the rule of many, the wisdom of the crowd, friends, and so on of our vaunted Web 2.0 are as yet very thin and understructured surrogates of place-based socialization processes. Now think not about the local, but about globalization. One of the questions that might be asked is, will online education develop in a way that predicates a new relation between the so-called first world and the rest of the world that might be called, and excuse me this barbarism, it's a new word that I'm inventing, post-neo-colonialism. The neo part of that formulation designates the reestablishment in new form of colonialism. The post part suggests an insecurity about where the center, as opposed to the periphery of the new colonialism actually lies, in the old first world, or instead in China, or the other economic and demographic tiger nations today. Let me unpack that one step at a time. First, we are entering a new age of the global university, when in the terms proposed by, and this is the next slide, Arnold de Meyer, Patrick Harker, and Gabriel Hawawini, the traditional import model of global education, for example, large numbers of students from China and other nations coming to US universities, and the traditional export model, for example, the burgeoning phenomenon of year abroad and campus abroad programs in US higher education, are both being augmented by a new network model. The network model is exemplified by NYU and Abu Dhabi. As you may know, NYU is now branding itself as the quote-unquote global network university with portal campuses in New York City and Abu Dhabi. I took my daughter, by the way, who's now 18, on an extended campus visit tour around the nation this past summer and fall. We had a great time visiting campuses. The most anomalous and interesting campus visit we had was to NYU, where for 1 hour of the presentation to parents and prospective students, we spent about half the hour in a hard sell on their Abu Dhabi campus. The vision there is you send your daughter or son to literally a desert island that they are building there to be with other students. And for their year abroad, they can come back to New York City. A variant form of the network model is Yale in Singapore, not yet built, which Yale University is now starting with the National University of Singapore. The main idea is that the university on this model doesn't just build satellite campus abroad programs, it builds, often with total subvention from the host country, entire parallel campuses designed, and this is the relevant point, to attract not just US students going abroad, but a trade surplus of tuition-paying international students from the host country and elsewhere in that region of the world. Now, seen in this context, online networked education is just part of the larger globally networked university phenomenon. The digital addendum to the global network university idea may be expressed as follows. Perhaps a university with global network university ambitions doesn't even need to build a portal campus in another country. All it has to do is build an online portal campus, like the UC 11th campus imagined by Christopher Edling. The idealistic goal, of course, is to encourage global intellectual and cultural exchange, to prepare our young for the global knowledge economy, and so on. But of course, it's impossible to miss alongside the ideals, the not so subtle signs of what I'm calling neo-colonialism. Edling's goal is, quote unquote, degree granting instruction by a premier institution with the kind of market appeal that UC campuses enjoy, not just in Barstow, but in Bangor and Beijing, close quote. The UK report on Collaborate to Compete similarly declares that the UK should invest in online education in part to outcompete other nations in the, quote, international market for online learning, close quote, and so on. When online higher education initiatives start out with a hope that there will be many Far Eastern and other international clients willing to pay full price so as de facto to subsidize the education of native students in California, the UK, and elsewhere, then knowledge is the new colonial mercantilism. You others around the world, send us the raw materials of your youth. We in the first world will finish and manufacture them and take a surcharge. This is what might be called knowledge work insourcing, the obverse of manufacturing work outsourcing. And oh, by the way, since you in the East appear to be outstripping us in the race for economic dominance in the future, let's be sure to set up the colonial relation also in reversible form so that our Western ideals of knowledge conform, let us say, kowtow, for instance, to cite one of the main criticisms of Yale in Singapore, to what is allowed to be said and taught in your authoritarian country. What I mean by post-neo-colonialism, in other words, is that global digital education programs today cover their bets about who is colonizing whom in today's world. The elephant in the room, of course, is that they in the so-called developing world now have the capital, and we in the developed world are now a debtor, nation or nations. Again, there are many more questions that follow along this branch of inquiry, but I will once more break off to go to yet another branch at the secondary level of my root question about what we want the University of the Digital Future to be. And this is the next slide. The next secondary question is as follows. What will be the relation between expertise and networked public knowledge in the digital age? This is something that I've actually been going around the country saying, something like Johnny Appleseed. I believe that the greatest single challenge for universities in the next 25 years or so, that is roughly one generation, will be to reinvent the practices, technologies, deliverables, and institutional structures, including promotion criteria of higher education, so as to renegotiate the relation between expertise and the new networked public knowledge. After all, Given the burgeoning networked public knowledge of Web 2.0, Wikipedia, crowdsourced knowledge, the rule of many, the wisdom of the crowd, and so on, why do we need experts? Or better, what role will experts play in the overall system of knowledge creation, dissemination, interpretation, and implementation, facilitated by new digital technologies that have opened up the domain of knowledge dissemination to the lay public? You know, there was an agonized discussion some years ago about where the public intellectual of the mid-20th century era has gone. What I'm suggesting today is that the whole debate about public intellectuals is obsolete in the face of today's puzzle. What is a networked intellectual? What room does Web 2.0 have for expertise? This question also can be unpacked into tertiary questions, which I'll just briefly touch upon. Some of these tertiary sub-questions are as follows. What would be the relation in digital higher education between research and teaching? Consider that many of the digital hardware and software solutions for digital pedagogy are equally useful for online collaborative research. The Sakai initiative is a case in point, since it bills itself as a learning management system and, I'm quoting here, a research collaboration system. Indeed, when I was first introduced into it, most of the advanced resources online seem to be research collaboration groups rather than courses. Yet the discussion of online, interactive, and hybrid digital education has, to my knowledge, largely elided the relation between teaching and research, an omission that mirrors the general tendency today to legitimate universities on the ground of their teaching mission, with any further legitimation based on research mission manifesting secondarily or separately, if at all, if, for example, in lists of scientific and engineering discoveries that the public likes. From what I can see, there's almost no public discussion of the necessarily organic relation between the university's teaching and research roles in society, with the result that universities are increasingly being positioned solely as knowledge content providers, agents of what the British call provision, with the origin of knowledge content shifted under the name of innovation to industry, or apparently to nowhere at all. Since in the new network public knowledge, it often seems that content is merely pre-existent, just a given to be remixed and repurposed. One of the declared core principles of Wikipedia, we note, is that, quote, Wikipedia does not publish original research, close quote. Another sub-question at the tertiary level here, should the standard of education be the best or the good enough? Once more, recall Bill Gates recommending the best lectures in the world and at least one great course online. Actually, Gates' naive echo of Matthew Arnold on the best which has been thought and said names what online media networks precisely do not seem to do best. A Google search, for example, returns hits that are not necessarily the best, but the most referred to, among which, more often than not, there's a Wikipedia article. Now, beginning in 2006, as you may recall, that's the year that I personally found it necessary to put online one of the first educational Wikipedia use policies. Wikipedia has become one of the great educational resources of the world, the go-to for both students and increasingly faculty when starting, or in the case of some students, ending research. Yet Wikipedia is incommensurable with the notion of the best. At any one time in either the production or consumption of its articles, it offers what is good enough, as one seeks a quick or initial grasp of a topic. In the parlance of social economists, it is not so much about satisfying us with knowledge, it's about satisficing us with knowledge. Of course, this is not to say that there hasn't been also plenty of controversy about whether the best should be the standard of higher education. Witness the culture wars over canonical masterworks courses, Western civilization courses, and so on. What I'm indicating here is simply that the now familiar culture wars are obsolete when the notion of the best is transformed into that of top hits or the wisdom of the moment through the filtering of vast logs of common knowledge through either algorithmic or collective, that is called Wikipedic, voting mechanisms. One more tertiary sub-question out of many that might be mentioned. Do I get tenure for writing a Wikipedia article? This is a short form of the issue, as I put it earlier, about how the practices, technologies, deliverables, and institutional structures of higher education will need to be renegotiated to accommodate a new relation between expertise and networked public knowledge. Other aspects of the issue include many actively under discussion today in the academy as it enters the digital age. For example, promotion policies friendly to digital and collaborative work, new forms of peer review, open access publication, and so on. Also germane, But to date, I think invisible in academic discussions is the mirror image effort from the network public knowledge sector to incorporate scholarly work in their work of online common knowledge. Witness, for instance, Wikipedia's public policy initiative, which last year recruited professors to supervise students in helping to improve the quality of Wikipedia's articles on public policy issues. Or earlier, Larry Sanger's Citizendium online encyclopedia, which requires that its editors in traditionally academic fields have, quote, the qualifications typically needed for a tenure-track academic position in the field, and that its editors in professional fields have, quote, the usual terminal degree in their field and at least 3 years responsible professional experience, and in most cases, several publications as well, close quote. As you might imagine, the number of actually published articles in Citizendium is still very low. Let me conclude my talk today by jumping at last to just one final branch at the secondary level of my root question about the future of the digital university. And this is the next slide. How should the digital humanities help shape the humanities for the university of the digital future? I'm out of time, so I won't try to rehearse here more than just some of the standard issues of the digital humanities field that many of us in this room are now familiar with. But I want to list them or rehearse them with a recommendation that every one of these issues now needs to be redefined from the perspective of the larger issues of the relationship between the digital humanities, and the national and global scene. We need to see how these issues, in other words, contribute to the facility by which the digital humanities help the humanities fit into a larger landscape of digitizing education and education. Here are some of the issues, and I'm just going to tick them off of my fingers without further elaboration. Teaching with tools or teaching the tools? The thought behind this issue goes something like this. So much of society today values engineering values. It values a university that provides tools and technologies and resources to help society to do things. Can we in the humanities wrap our minds around a tool-based version of what we do in the humanities? Can the digital humanities help the humanities communicate what it does best in forms that can be understood as tools for thinking, for culture, for education? Secondly, learning the idea of data. The sub-issue here has been much talked about of late through Franco Moretti's work. The sub-issue is distance reading. You know, some years ago, I went to a conference of the Society for Textual and Discourse Studies, I think it was, in Minnesota. I had not done my homework in advance. I did not realize that it was a society primarily of scientists and linguists studying brain psychology of reading. It was shocking to realize that the first question after every slide presentation at that event was basically, show us your data. A question that is rarely, if ever, heard in humanities forum. I suggest to you that in the future, as the humanities needs to begin to advocate its value to society at large, it's going to need to be able to talk in terms of data. The digital humanities, therefore, may have a role to play in intruding into the worldview of the humanities scholar and others, the fact that their tools and their data sets, whether the data set be simply a collection of books or otherwise, needs to be presented to the public as something that we are working with, improving, and adding to the public store of knowledge. We need to get our minds around the idea of data. Third issue that I'm ticking off here, the past versus the present. As you may know, I spent many years thinking about the role of the sense of history. That's actually the topic that carried me over from my earlier New Historicist work to my contemporary digital humanities work. I became fascinated in what happens to the sense of history in a world of information technologies in which we seem to need no more history than what fits on a single screen of tweets rolling off into oblivion. History. How will the digital humanities help the humanities make the case for a necessary connection between the past and the present of knowledge, between the nature of information and the nature of knowledge in a larger humanistic perspective? Are there tools? Are there data sets? Are there technologies, best practices, and more importantly, assumptions to be uncovered behind those that might knit together the humanistic understanding of what its business is, introducing us to the best, as it were, of the history of thought, language, and so on, and what the rest of the world thinks that it values, the best of what an engineering firm or a Microsoft or an Apple has to offer right now in its iPad version 2 or something like that. A fourth issue, reinventing reading, and along with that, critical thought and interpretation. I spent the last 5 years supervising a project at the University of California called Transliteracies. It's a project studying the online practices, technologies, and implications of reading. This has given us a lot to think about, and the main discovery that I've made is that the basic understanding of what reading needs to be should be rethought by the humanities with the assistance of digital humanists. One of the most eye-opening exercises that I assign my students in my series of courses called Literature Plus were the preliminary set of pedestrian exercises I thought them to be, by which before building their project at the end of the course, before writing their critical essay about the project, they would do some data research. They would then write up some annotated bibliographies. They would write up some summaries. They would write up other objective, lower order kinds of work. What I discovered was that teaching them to write, for example, an annotated bibliography was no trivial exercise, that it really required me to think through the assumptions about what an annotated bibliography was, who was for, what the tone of voice was of the person writing it, how much information should be in it, what the nature of that exercise actually was. It made me think as well that we in the humanities have for too long merely assumed as routine the kinds of skill sets that we require our students to have before they can be brought to the point of writing a critical essay. We're simply going to have to pay more attention, hopefully with the help of the digital humanities, in beginning to think about the lower ordered activities of what is actually involved in reading properly today. After all, our students, the vast majority of them, are going to be hired by firms, by non-governmental organizations, by governments and others, who when they want reading skill, they're not talking about reading a novel in close reading form. They're talking about the ability to process large pools of data sets, filter, process, summarize, and report upwards. And finally, one other issue that I will bring up that is alive in the digital humanities today in a way that makes an impact on the role of the humanities in the future. Let us call this topic the reinvention of argument. I give many talks today before audiences that are not solely humanities-based. I talk among engineers, I talk among others, for whom, as you may know, the idea of coming up before the lecture and giving a speech from a prepared text in highly linear and well-crafted form is just nuts. They look at you like you're crazy if you've written this out as a critical argument, a narrative argument, or an essay. Why not just ship it to them in email form, and they will run it through their algorithm and see what word frequency lists they can come up with from it. I'm now beginning to think that the humanities is going to need to rethink, probably with the help of the digital humanities, what the shape, system, ecology, and overall format of the argument will be in the future. Critical argument, narrative argument will still have an important role to play. It's not clear to me, however, that it will forever have the monarch position as the terminal point of all the activities that are engaged in reading, writing, and thinking. For example, in many of the other disciplines and in Franco Moretti's books about distant reading, it appears very much that visualizations, charts, and tables are now the terminal point, the deliverable of an argument, and that all the narrative work is done as a preliminary to the table or chart or graph or diagram that one produces. Will the humanities in the future have to evolve to such a point where the critical argument is done as a preliminary step in shaping a project or a data set, or merely an iterative step in the production of such knowledge? Final slide in the presentation. In short, the function of the digital humanities at the present time, if I may update Matthew Arnold on the function of criticism at the present time, is to assist the humanities in ensuring that this voice is heard in answering the question, what do we want the University of the Digital Future to be? Those are what I mean by the big questions that I confess I've rarely had the time to think with as I untangle one bundle of wires from another. Thank you.